There was a time before automobiles and shopping malls and cell phones when you had to work pretty hard to get the things you needed just to live a reasonable life. In fact, most of life's essentials, like the clothing on your back, the food on your table, even the house in which you lived, were the product of muscle, human as well as animal, and individual skill. Because you had to grow or make the things you needed, it took a lot longer to get them. Want fast food? Forget it. No drive-in chicken joints here. A new house, a bigger barn? Start with the trees at the edge of the forest. But about 200 years ago, all that began to change with the help of mills. These early factories turned out machine-made products that could be bought in stores, and they offered a new way of working that changed the way people lived. Societies that once responded to the rhythm of the sun and seasons now move to the beating of the clock. This industrial revolution would bring giant factories and working classes, entrepreneurs and inventors, and an era we call mill times.
Major funding for Mill Times has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, for 30 years expanding our understanding of the world, and by the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. Funding is also provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
So what did people do 200 years ago if they needed a necessity of life like clothing? Say you need a new pair of pants or a shirt. There's no mall nearby, so you have to make them. And the first thing you must do is gather the raw material. Now in some regions you turn to cotton or flax, but here at New England's Old Sturbridge Village you turn to sheep for their wool. Of course, it wasn't that easy. Sheep shearing was a laborious process for the shearer and the sheep. And then you had to have someone with enough skill to turn all this raw wool into cloth. After cleaning the wool, it had to be carded. This took strong fingers and prickly brushes, like pet brushes, to untangle and separate the fibers, and to create wispy tubes of wool called slivers. You then stretched the slivers into yarn on a spinning wheel. Notice how the yarn gets twisted as it winds onto the spindle? This makes it strong enough to weave without breaking. You turn yarn into fabric on a loom, and this is a typical hand loom. Now, weaving was done by both men and women, so I should probably do okay at this. First of all, we have to set up the loom by drawing threads from the warp beam behind the loom across the top to another beam near my feet. The warp threads pass through harnesses, which I can raise or lower by pressing down on these foot pedals, and when I do that, it creates a space between alternating sets of warp threads. I'm going to take the shuttle, which is this wooden contraption with a spool of yarn in it called a bobbin, and I'm going to push it across through that space perpendicular to the warp threads. I then press it down, change pedals to raise the other harness to create that over and under pattern that you get used to seeing in weaving. I send the shuttle back through, pull it snug, tamp it down, and repeat this process over and over again until there's something else I'm supposed to do or my arms fall off. You can see just how much time is going to go into this to produce enough fabric to make clothes. I mean, there's the carding and the spinning and the weaving, then there's the cutting and the stitching and so on, which sort of explains why people back then would have had relatively few clothes. But by the middle of the 1700s, help was on the way. And it began with water-powered machines. For centuries, people had used the turning force of water wheels to help with tough jobs like driving blades for sawing wood, and rotating coarse stones for grinding grain into flour. But eventually, water wheels began to power more complicated devices that would revolutionize cloth making, like this carding machine. What an improvement over the pet brushes. And by rolling out wispy slivers all day long, it was a great labor-saving device. But this was even better. I'm standing next to a machine called a water frame. It was created by the famous English inventor Richard Arkwright, this model's from the 1780s, to spin cotton into yarn. Though it looks fairly complex, it really isn't. It runs on water power, just like the carding machine and saw blades we saw earlier. The cotton in the top spools is drawn out by the action of the machine, which twists it nice and tight, and then gathers the yarn onto these bottom spools. It works just like a hand spinning wheel. 96 of them, actually. So it's little wonder that spinning by machine would eventually make spinning by hand obsolete. In no time, spinning mills began springing up all over England. By the late 1700s, these mills were putting whole villages to work, making yarn inside the new factories or weaving it into cloth in their homes. The spinning industry was so successful, it quickly spread to the rest of Europe. And it was only a matter of time before it reached England's former colonies in America as well. All mills need a steady supply of running water. And here in New England, there's plenty of rain and melting snow to feed powerful rivers that once drove the big wheels of the new textile mills. But any river's flow can be unpredictable. Sometimes there's too much water, sometimes not enough. So to control the power of the river, mill owners built dams. Now this old dam on the Branch River in Rhode Island is a typical mill dam. It doesn't completely block the river, but it raises the height of the water to create an elevated mill pond. Now, if we dig a channel called a head race from the pond to the mill, that pent-up water behind the dam will flow through the head race, turn the wheel, and then rejoin the river through the tail race. So dams and their ponds acted like storage tanks for the H2O fuel the water wheel engines ran on. You can still find scores of mill dams all along New England's rivers. But this one in Pawtucket, Rhode Island is special because it powered America's very first spinning mill. Legend has it that in 1789, a young entrepreneur named Samuel Slater defied the laws of England by supervising the construction of English-style cotton spinning machinery at the mill in Pawtucket. England had tried to protect its fledgling monopoly on spinning machines with patents. But Slater, who worked in the mills, understood how to make similar machines and came to America to seek his fortune. Other Rhode Island mills quickly followed Slater's successful venture, including the picturesque Wilkinson Mill right next door, which houses a beautifully restored water wheel and gives us a pretty good idea of how a power train actually works. At the Wilkinson Mill, water from the head race flows into a wheelhouse, where it steadily turns the big water wheel. The wheel is connected to revolving metal gears. And as the gears turn in rhythm with the wheel, they rotate a vertical pole called the main shaft. The main shaft rises through the ceiling and extends all the way to the top of the building. On each floor, the vertical shaft turns horizontal shafts that hang just below the ceiling. A leather belt carries the power from those horizontal shafts to a pair of pulleys above each machine. Now, to get the power to the machine itself, I'm going to turn the machine on by sliding the belt from one pulley to another. And voila, the machine works. Now, this is not a spinning machine, it's a lathe. A lot of mills, like Wilkinson, had their own machine shops. This is a wood lathe. It was actually used to produce those humble workhorses of the spinning industry, the bobbin. Yarn from the spinning machines was spooled onto bobbins. And in the beginning, that's all the textile mills produced, yarn. But by the 1820s, inventors had finally figured out how to make machines that could take all those spools of yarn and weave them into cloth. This power loom is weaving a plain piece of fabric. All the things I had to do on the hand loom are now being performed by this machine, only a whole lot faster. In fact, the wooden shuttle I threw by hand whips its thread back and forth so quickly, we have to slow down the action for you to see it. These looms could be very dangerous. If a shuttle like this should break free, it could pierce your flesh like a bullet. If you got your sleeve caught, it could cost you an arm. But when the power loom was perfected, weaving, like yarn spinning before it, would move from the home to the mill. Many newer mills became huge as owners sought greater profits by bringing carding, spinning, and weaving all under the same roof. As more and more mills sprang up, there was increased competition and the occasional dispute over issues like backwater. Backwater would occur when one mill's dam impeded the natural flow of the river to the point where water wheels in upstream mills couldn't turn properly. Because water was so valuable as fuel, clashes over water rights were common. But with the demand for machine-made textiles soaring, it looked like everyone's profits would just keep flowing. This huge room would have been fairly typical of weaving floors in the big textile mills of the 19th century. As mills grew larger, some of them changed, from businesses that could be managed by 1 or 2 people and a small workforce to a factory system with hundreds of workers and scores of managers, overseers, and accountants. The biggest problem for the biggest mills, like Boot Mill here in Lowell, Massachusetts, was finding enough workers to run the machinery. In the early 19th century, 9 out of 10 Americans still lived on farms and had no experience with mill work. Without enough skilled hands to run the complex machinery, the big mills of Lowell, Massachusetts would have remained a dream. It was American textile entrepreneur Francis Cabot Lowell who had the vision in the first place. He had witnessed the terrible conditions faced by mill workers in England and decided he could create a wholesome atmosphere that would attract country women to work in his mills. When he offered decent wages too, the daughters of cash-strapped farmers flocked to this unique city of mills and became famous as the Lowell Girls. When they arrived, the women found that Lowell was serious about the wholesome atmosphere. There were rules and curfews that everyone had to follow, even when they weren't working. Drinking alcohol was strictly prohibited, for example. And to further protect their reputations and souls, employers required all women to attend Sunday church service. All other times, bells called the women to work. Their day would last 12 to 13 hours or more. And when they weren't working, they spent most of their time inside one of the hundreds of boarding houses scattered throughout the city. The women of Lowell were very well fed by their employers. One wrote, "We had cod soup, baked cod, and fish hash. We have pie 2 or 3 times a day, coffee, and warm biscuits." All the workers got 3 decent meals a day, clean linens, and a room to sleep in, and all for about $1.25 a week. Now that may sound like a bargain, but it only left them $2 or $3 a week after working for 70 hours or more. Now that's about the same as a few $100s in today's money. Not great for all that work, but still a lot better than working on the farm, where they probably would have gotten nothing. Excuse me, is there any more of that fish hash? The young women lived in cramped rooms with 2 or 3 beds to a room. Sharing beds wasn't too bad, considering they often slept in worse conditions back home. They loved to write letters and keep journals. Complaints about rodents, the communal outhouse, and a lack of privacy were common. But most women clearly liked the boarding house life and the excitement of the city, especially on Sundays, their one day off. After church, they would spend their time courting, socializing, or promenading in the fresh air. They might attend a play, a lecture, or a concert, until this brief respite was over. And then it was back to the mills for another week of heavy toil. The work at Lowell was fast-paced and strenuous. The noise of the machinery made some workers deaf, and the dust-filled air was unhealthy to breathe. Most women saved their money and left after a few years. Some returned home. Others struck out to make their own destiny. But while they were here, they became highly skilled workers capable of performing the intricate tasks that made these mills successful. This is Moses Brown, the Rhode Island businessman who enticed Samuel Slater to Pawtucket and then helped finance Slater's pioneering cotton mill. Moses was a chance taker who was fascinated by inventions like his prized electrostatic generator and by visionary enterprises like spinning mills. I'm standing in the beautifully restored home of Moses' brother, John Brown, who was a fighting patriot, a friend of George Washington's, and a very successful financier. John owned a world-renowned shipping company and was a prominent investor in the manufacture of rum, the smelting of iron, and the trading of slaves. His businesses made him extremely rich, so he built this impressive home in Providence and filled it with famous guests and fine furnishings. Though they were both successful businessmen, the Brown brothers did not necessarily see eye to eye. John was unabashed in his support of the slave trade, and Moses, a converted and devout Quaker, was so opposed to slavery, he fought hard to abolish it. But like his brother, Moses Brown remained an entrepreneur, and when he chanced upon textile manufacturing, he could hardly have imagined he was helping to transform New England. Now, Moses was basically an investor in the industry. Other textile pioneers built their mills from the ground up and spent their lives trying to make them successful. This bucolic-looking place is Harrisville, New Hampshire. Harrisville began as a single woolen mill, and like similar enterprises, grew in size and importance after the American embargo of British textiles in 1809. The mill was started by Bethuel Harris and his sons, Cyrus and Milan. With a few $1,000s and a dozen workers, they began a woolen operation that would last 150 years. The Harrises lived in those houses over there, not a stone's throw from their mill. Over time, they built more mills, boarding houses for single workers, and individual homes for families. Milan Harris even built this schoolhouse for the workers' children, which, unfortunately, was very cold in the winter. Rather than repair the drafty schoolhouse, he stuffed wool, which he had plenty of, into the cracks in the floors. The result was that the teachers and kids nearly froze, and Milan was chastised by state authorities for running one of the worst schools in New Hampshire. But the Harrises were not mean or greedy, and treated their workers fairly when they could afford to. For unlike rich owners, the Harrises were completely dependent on the fortunes of their mill. They personally fixed machinery, fought icy wheels, hired and fired workers, sweated over accounts, and hustled for business. If prices fell or labor costs rose or natural disasters struck, their enterprise could fail instantly. And without the deep pockets of rich mill owners, the Harrises were never far from financial ruin. But with equal parts luck and hard work, the Harrises made it, becoming country comfortable rather than Brown family rich. And for mill owners like the Harrises, that was enough. Now, not all New England textile mills succeeded, but the big cotton mills generally did very well, because the American South was an excellent source of cheap slave-grown cotton and an even better market for machine-made cloth. Abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner railed against the conspiracy between the Lords of the Lash in the South and the Lords of the Loom in the North. Thinking that Sumner had equated them with slaves, Lowell's workers passionately declared themselves the daughters of freemen. But mill workers could be treated very unfairly, especially when demand fell and prices dropped. Owners could cut wages, increase hours, or speed up production, all in an effort to maintain profits. On rare occasions, workers fought back by turning out or going on strike. But then, as now, such tactics could be very risky for both sides. Benchley has been on the brink of another disaster. The first night I lit candles, he sent for his children to come home, which they did. Afterwards, he and I had a considerable of a warm debate. Now, the letter was the telephone of its day, the primary means of communication over distance. And this letter from Samuel Slater shows his annoyance with a parent named Benchley, who kept his children from working in the mill even after Slater had lit extra candles so they could see in the dark. Yes, children worked hard at Slater and at other mills throughout New England. They also worked on farms and in craft shops, just about everywhere. Few children had the luxury of going to school full-time, and working in the mills at least meant a decent place to eat and sleep. Slater appreciated his younger workers. What he complained about were their overly protective parents and the fickle adult workers who were constantly leaving him to work in other mills. He was also unhappy about his personal fortune. Though he ran a successful mill that bore his name, he was not the majority owner and felt he could do better with his own venture. So in 1806, he built a new mill complex and proudly named it Slatersville. Over the decades, the surrounding community grew along with the mill. And by mid-century, the Slater family had built 2 additional mills and installed steam engines to help power the machinery. Quarrybank Mill in England houses an early working model. This remarkable contraption is an old steam engine. Look at the precise movement of the vertical piston. It's moved up and down by the rise and fall of steam pressure inside the cylinder. And that up and down motion is converted into rotary motion, which operates all the machines. This was a revolutionary device. It made it possible to run machines any time, any place, and in any kind of weather. Over the years, operators used both steam power and water power. But eventually, the steam engine replaced water wheels as the primary source of power for most mills. With steam engines to run machinery, mills no longer had to be located near rivers. And once freed from the river, the stage was set for the demise of the New England mill. By the middle of the 20th century, many New England textile companies had moved south, where labor was cheap, where cotton grew right outside the door, and where swift-moving rivers no longer mattered. In more recent decades, the industry has moved to even cheaper labor markets in Asia and the Pacific. Today, the largest textile centers in the world lie far beyond the United States and Great Britain, leaving places like Slatersville abandoned and desolate. In England and New England, the textile industry is only a shadow of the enterprise it once was, and many old mills are now rotting from neglect or completely gone. A few communities have restored mill buildings, turning them into apartments, shopping malls, even art studios. But here in New England, the industry that supported generation after generation of working families is, for the most part, over. At their height, mills were criticized for bringing a decline in craftsmanship and a machine-like regimentation to the workplace. But they created enormous benefits as well. As anchors for cities, as innovators of new technologies, They put vast numbers of people to work and brought affordable products to consumers everywhere. For better or worse, mills have shaped our world and the way we live as surely as any force in history.
Major funding for Mealtimes has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, for 30 years expanding our understanding of the world, and by the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. Funding is also provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you.